Please be seated. Six years ago, Richard Rinaldi boarded a subway with his big 8x10 view camera and a terrible idea. He wanted to photograph strangers physically touching each other. So he asked a man named Alfredo in a worn sheepskin coat, a ball cap pulled down over his unruly mop of hair, to embrace Jessica Ong, a confident-looking woman whom he'd never met before, with piercing dark eyes and a purple scarf tied neatly around her neck. In the photograph, Alfredo's arm is draped kind of uncomfortably around Jessica's shoulders. Jessica's grasping the subway pole very tightly with her right arm, but her left hand is resting kind of easily on Alfredo's right one. Richard Rinaldi found this very first photograph of his Touching Strangers series tentative. It was tentative, he says, because I was so tentative. But Mr. Rinaldi kept at it, traveling around the country, asking all sorts of strangers to make the simple kinds of physical contact with each other that we usually reserve for our family and our most intimate friends. And then he took their pictures. In Chicago, there was Andrea, a 20-something man with a faux hawk hairdo, standing belly to belly with Lily, a middle-aged African-American woman who is touching his pencil-thin beard with her thumb. Both are looking straight into the camera. Lily's eyes are wide and a little mischievous, but Andrea's are oddly calm, especially for someone with his chin in a strange woman's fingers. Paul and Andrew look like they could be father and son, with the same narrow jaw lines, the same sandy brown hair and goatees, but these two are strangers as well. Andrew wears sweatpants rolled to the knee and a baggy brown t-shirt that's dirty and torn. Paul is dressed all in black, except for the little white square of his clerical collar. His hands are resting on the young man's shoulders, and Andrew's laid his hand tenderly on one of the priests. There's Ava in Cincinnati, whose 7-year-old knees are draped across the armrest of Aaron's wheelchair. She is a little white girl, smiling contentedly as she sits in the lap of a shirtless black man with tattooed shoulders, a bushy beard, and a kind grin. Jeremy of Columbus is wearing cowboy boots and a cowboy hat, sitting on a bench with his elbows and knees splayed wide, while a delicate Matthew in a tight green tank top, glasses, close-cropped hair, stands behind him with the perfect posture of a dancer, his hand on the cowboy's thick shoulder. An American flag hangs on the fairground tent wall behind them. Maybe you can tell I'm fighting off the urge to describe every last one of the dozens of these photographs from Richard Rinaldi's website. I could not stop looking at them this week, in part because they're just beautiful and striking. But knowing that the subjects are all people who've agreed to hold the hand or embrace the shoulders or sit on the lap of someone they've never met before made this series seem like a glimpse of the kingdom of heaven. A glimpse of this world of fear and estrangement in the process of being healed, reconciled, made slowly whole again by the touch of one stranger by another. I was a stranger, Jesus said, and you welcomed me. This is how Jesus says his kingdom comes to us. Not in the familiar, but in the strange. I have to say that in this great and disturbing scene of judgment in Matthew 25, welcoming the stranger seems like a grenade dropped into the middle of an otherwise somewhat doable list. At least it does to me. I think I can find ways to give food and drink and clothing to people, maybe participate in a prison ministry too, if that's what it takes to get into Jesus' kingdom. These things happen here at Calvary every week. You can sign up for them. Check them off your Get Into Heaven card if that's how you think redemption works. But welcoming the stranger seems to ask for something else. It seems to demand a vulnerability I am just not wired to allow. Now, it's an unhelpful accident that the English word stranger does not rhyme with Jesus. It rhymes with danger. We all know this, right? Because we were taught this as children. Stranger means danger. Remember that? This isn't an entirely ridiculous thing to teach a child, but it's probably less reasonable than we think. And it probably has more to do with my fears as a parent than with the actual danger strangers pose. The danger we were taught to fear from strangers was kidnapping, right? But a few years ago, the Washington Post reported that child abductions by strangers or slight acquaintances represent 0.01% of all missing children. What we do know is that a category of people much more likely to abduct a child is family. Mercifully, we've decided that instilling a categorical fear of families probably isn't the best way to keep a child safe in this world. It's at least worth asking whether the same might be true of the category almost all of humanity occupies for each one of us, strangers. Of course, even if our fear of strangers doesn't make a lot of statistical sense, it makes some biological sense. If you're out hunting and gathering, you'd better have the adrenaline kick in pretty forcefully and fast at the sound or glimpse of something strange. It could mean the difference in who's having whom for dinner. But I'm happy to report that getting eaten is also pretty low on the list of ways you and I are likely to meet our demise, even in the jungle that is downtown Memphis. Our fears, then, may be understandable, but they can be very unreliable guides through this life. And so, from the earliest moments in Scripture, we see this theme of worry, that the very familiar human fear of the other, of the outsider, of the strange one, is what has pushed us away from one another from the beginning. And Scripture says such fear does great damage to us. Scripture says it must not be the driving force in our lives. In the early moments of Genesis, we see that life of innocent vulnerability break down as sin and shame enter the garden. Man is alienated from woman, humans from God, siblings from each other, humanity from the earth itself. In a few chapters, people are scattering from Babel in confusion and more estrangement. We see that our languages and our cultures and political structures may well serve the purpose of binding us together in groups, but they often do so at the exclusion of and suspicion of people who are not like us, people who are not of us, people who talk funny or look funny or eat funny foods, people who are strangers to us, in other words, become frightening threats. Genesis provides us with ancient origin stories for our strangers and our enemies. But the stories also tell us that our separation from one another is not what God intended, and it's not what keeps us safe. Fear of the other is the source of the alienation from which so much suffering and violence still springs in this world. And so Jesus comes along saying, I was a stranger, in a line of wisdom that's already centuries old when he spoke it, and you welcomed me. This welcome, he says, is how God's kingdom arrives. I really don't believe that welcoming strangers is just a command to do one more hard thing, one more good deed, so that we'll be accepted by God. That's not the gospel of grace. What I do believe is that Jesus wants us to change our responses to strangers in order to heal the alienation and estrangement that are the defining characteristics of a broken and sinful world. The alienation and estrangement that can be the defining characteristics of our own fearful hearts and lives as well. We just can't exclude those who are strange to us from our lives and have our souls expand into the abundant life God has made us for. But it's hard. The call to welcome the stranger is hard because it seems to demand that I go against a deep-seated response I have to the world. I don't think I can just think my way out of this one. The change needs to go deeper down. But how? Well, last Sunday, I got to sit in on the youth confirmation class here at Calvary. And the topic was, what makes Calvary, Calvary? So we talked about what these young people valued most about this place. I know what you're thinking. You thought they'd all jump in and say, well, the sermons are awesome. Somehow sermons didn't come up. Maybe that's next week. But they also didn't talk about Calvary as a safe and loving and nurturing environment, which it most certainly is for them. What these young people did say, over and over again, in different ways, was that they valued most the encounters they have here with people who are radically different from them. People who may have slept outside last night, whose bodies and minds may have suffered damage along their way in the world. They said they'd come to realize that there were people in this world that they weren't so afraid of anymore because they come downtown to a church where downtown troubles and strangeness stumble through the doors all the time. Curious line from that old hymn was making sense to me, maybe for the first time. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. These young people were thankful that the grace of strangers had been teaching their hearts and healing their fears since childhood. It's true enough that our fear of strangers has deep, deep evolutionary and biological roots. But what these confirmands were showing me is that there's a spiritual longing in each one of us, even deeper down, that wants to reach across the strangeness that divides us and make contact with other lives. They reminded me that fear is not the only human response to what's strange. We are wired just as surely for wonder and curiosity and connection. I want to relearn this essential fact about our souls. Jesus says we're not made to inhabit a kingdom of fear. We're made for communion. We're made to reach out, to touch, to embrace those who are strange to us. Jesus says we can't come fully alive to his kingdom any other way. This is the last Sunday in the Christian year. But I wonder if we could take Jesus' invitation to welcome the stranger with us off into the whole year to come. What if we were to look at everything we do, everything we hope for, all the ways we arrange ourselves as Calvary Church through these 8 simple words? I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I have no doubt the practice would expose the many, many ways strangers are welcomed at Calvary every day. But it also seems to take so little to make a stranger of another human being these days, doesn't it? Voting for the wrong party, holding a contrary opinion will do. What new possibilities might come into view as we wonder together how everything from our programs to our parking lots might serve Jesus' call to welcome people whom we don't yet understand. A stranger or two might well be included. But Jesus says you and I are the ones whose lives can be expanded and enlarged in this process. Because the kingdom he invites us into is not fleeting or new. It is the communion we humans were made for, prepared for us since the foundation of the world. A kingdom, he says, we can begin to inhabit a little more fully even today in the simple, vulnerable, sacred practice of touching strangers.